Hey guys, I'm Julia and I'm one of the TAs for this class, and this week I'll be giving you guys the design lecture for week 10. So today we're going to be covering the concept of accessibility. Currently in the United States there are over 56 million people, so a nearly 1 in 5 ratio, and over 1 billion people worldwide who have a disability. And in 2017 alone, there were actually 814 website accessibility lawsuits that were filed in federal and state courts. So accessibility is definitely a really important thing that you should consider when you're doing web design. So what exactly is accessible design, you may ask? Well, it's basically the degree to which a website is accessible by as many people as possible. Certain users, they navigate the internet using only the keyboard rather than the mouse or trackpad on your computer. So it's important that as website designers and website developers, we account for these differences in user behavior. There are also other users who have motor impairments, who have color blindness, and etc. And they rely on these kinds of assistive technologies such as screen readers or other keyboard functionalities to be able to navigate through a website. And sometimes we take these everyday objects for granted. In recent years, there's been a lot of assistive technology that has been released to help people with these different kinds of disabilities navigate around these everyday objects. And one example actually is Microsoft's Xbox game controller. So they've actually released a new kind of assistive adaptable controller that people, gamers with disabilities, they can also play as opposed to using the old traditional controller, which you see on the left side. The buttons might be too small, and it's also generally made for people who have both hands, whereas a lot of people with disabilities, they don't have sometimes the luxury of being able to play with two hands. So as you can see here, this kind of outlines the different kinds of buttons that you would see on an Xbox controller. And you can see that there's two huge buttons in the center, and that's made for people who tend to not have as much sensitivity in their hands, or maybe they only have one hand to play with. And if we watch this video, you guys can get a better idea of how exactly this adaptive technology that Xbox has released helps gamers with these kinds of disabilities. Sorry.
At Xbox, we have a controller design that our fans love. However, for gamers with limited mobility or gamers who don't use both their hands, this controller design might not work best for them.
I pushed you out of the way, I'm sorry. Doorknobs are the worst thing ever invented. Putting on shoes, the cell phones that I use, these are the sorts of things that we don't think about until we have to, and I think about them every day.
Yeah! I have cerebral palsy on my entire right side. This side of the controller is fine. This side doesn't happen. As game platforms have gotten more sophisticated, the controllers have gotten more sophisticated, and it started to get really frustrating.
We designed the Xbox Adaptive Controller through feedback from the accessibility community.
The Xbox Adaptive Controller is really easy. You just plug it in, and then you can plug in various other devices. I can make it work for me the way it has to.
With the Xbox Adaptive Controller, a gamer can game with one hand and one foot, or one hand and their shoulder, or even one foot and their chin.
And I can change it from game to game.
Good, ready? Forward, squeeze tall, there it is.
Craig Hospital is a facility for patients who've either had a spinal cord injury or a traumatic brain injury, and it's a place for their rehab.
Yes. We're here for game night, and we're helping new patients getting back into gaming again. Is that the D-pad?
Yeah.
Okay.
Our role as occupational therapists is to get people back to doing. When the Xbox Adaptive Controller came along, it acted like an Xbox controller and it just worked.
Uh-oh. Over there.
On the standard Xbox controller, it's just hard to press the buttons because can't really put pressure through my hands. But then with the adaptive controller, I can use like larger joysticks, larger buttons that are easier to press and reach.
Corey and his brother Zachary are twins. Before Corey's injury, Zachary had gamed with him regularly, and that was the way that they related to each other as siblings.
Who do you love playing Xbox with here at Craig Hospital?
Zach.
The Xbox Adaptive Controller and the Copilot feature allowed them again to play games together. So there's a huge social component to it.
You got that? Yes, yes. They can play any game that they want. I see the confidence just burst out of them.
Yeah, so that was a really nice example of a product that a big corporation has, spent a lot of money and time into investing to make that would make a lot of other people who have these kinds of disabilities a lot happier and feel a lot more included in something that should be available to everyone. So, how exactly do we design for accessibility? As designers, we have the very important responsibility to make sure that everyone in the world can access the type of information that websites provide, regardless of their innate physical or mental capabilities. Making our work accessible, it brings a better experience for everyone. And it's actually not that hard. So in this lecture, I'm going to go over a few steps that everyone, as web designers, can take to ensure that their websites are properly accessible. So just to start off with, there's a very useful tool that you can use. It's a Chrome browser plugin. It's called Axe. And basically, it's a web accessibility testing tool. So you can simply test the accessibility of your website using this Chrome plugin to see whether your website is following all of these accessibility guidelines. So first, let's start with our basic standards for typography and color. So color is a really important aspect of design. But a lot of people in the world, they may be colorblind on varying levels, and sometimes they can't rely on color to differentiate between different components on a web page. So actually, there's a standard by the WCAG that states that every website they should follow a contrast ratio, which is basically a property of a display system defined as the ratio of the luminance of the brightest color, which would be white, to that of the darkest color, which is black, that the system is capable of producing. And generally, the rule is that the color contrast ratio should be between 4.5 to 1 for larger fonts or 3 to 1 for fonts that are smaller than 19 points. So this is really important because as you see on the right side, there's two different speech bubbles. One of them is just pure purple, and then there's white text on top of it. And the other one is striped with varying levels of pink and purple, and then there's also white text on the front. Clearly, you can see that the one on the left is a lot easier to read because there's a lot more color contrast. Yeah, so something that you should always keep in mind is that color shouldn't be the only visual means of conveying information. You should try to use an indicator other than colors, such as text labels or patterns. And especially when you're trying to show errors on the screen, try not to rely on just colored text alone. Maybe add an icon or include a title to the message. There's a lot of other visual cues as well, such as font weights or underlined text styles. And as well, icons. They're super important, and they can be used very effectively to convey different things on a web page as well. So on the right side, you can see that there's two different forms. The left side is what you would see if you were, for example, like completely colorblind. You would just see the text, and then you would just see the email, create password, confirm password, and then all those form elements in pure gray and white format. To a lot of people, or to colorblind people, they wouldn't be able to tell that there are errors in that form. Because on the right side, you can see that you've highlighted the input fields with a red border indicating that there's an error. So something that you could do instead is use an icon. For example, at the bottom of the right side of the form, you can see that there's a warning triangle symbol. So that's really useful because when that shows up, the user can then know that, oh, there's an error, and they don't have to rely on the red borders to see. Yeah, so icons, again, they're a really good way universally to display information. You can find a lot of icons on the Noun project or Flaticon. Those tend to be the most popular sources where you can find icons to use on your website. You can also use an app like Color Oracle, which shows you in real time what people with common color vision impairments see in terms of when they're viewing your website. Yeah, so again, try to use labels or instructions with form fields and inputs rather than just relying on colors. People who use screen readers usually navigate through a form using the tab key on their keyboard rather than, for example, using their cursor or using their trackpad. So it's important that, when you're creating form fields, that not only do you have a placeholder, and I'm guilty of this as well. I usually tend to only use placeholders for my text fields. You should also use a label because screen readers will then catch on that text instead of if you only use the placeholder, then the screen reader won't be able to know what that input field is about. Yeah. So these are some examples of really good forms. You can see that for the input fields, they all have a label. So for example, email and password, and then they specify or login using social media, and they include the social media buttons underneath. A lot of times you might see that people only use placeholder text in their input fields, or they only include those social media buttons without any label to them, and people with screen readers would not be able to know what those text fields actually mean. Another really important feature that every web designer should include on the website as well is focus states. So I don't know if you've noticed, but if you click on an input field on a web page, for example, you would see a blue highlighted border around that input field, and that's actually a good sign. So for example, on the right, you can see that the last name input field is highlighted with the blue color, and that indicates to people that, that input field is currently in focus. So it's really important to indicate where the user is at, and commonly this is done with a blue highlight. Yeah, so, there are some people out there who actively want to try and get rid of that blue border, but we're telling you, don't sacrifice usability for simplicity. Keep that blue border, even though it might look just a little bit ugly. It helps people with impairments and disabilities navigate components of your web page. And it's on by default, so you don't have to worry about, trying to get rid of it or anything. Just leave it as how it is. Yeah, so I kind of mentioned this already before, but, a lot of people with impairments, they use keys on their keyboard to navigate throughout the page. So you want to make sure that your web page supports keyboard navigation and it doesn't use excessively hover to rely on things. Yeah, so if you want to use hover, try not to use it for everything on your page. Only use it for less important things, not action items. Because if you hover over it, those things cannot be discovered by people with keyboard navigation or screen readers. So when you navigate through a page, also keep in mind that the order of the interactive elements is essential. The navigation must be logical and intuitive, so when you click tab, it should generally follow the normal visual flow of the page. So for example, it should go from left to right and top to bottom, and when you press tab continuously, it should go from like the header to the main navigation and whatever buttons you have in your content on your page, and then finally like your footer links. Yeah, so one thing you could do is just to test your website by pressing tab yourself and seeing where those different tab presses like take you on the page. So one way you could kind of hard code these keyboard inputs is assigning tab index to your inputs so that when the user presses tab, it can, I guess, direct them immediately to certain parts of the page. And another really useful thing that you could use to increase the accessibility of your website is to use alternative text for your images and other non-text content. So I don't know if you guys remember, but in homework 7 for this semester, the Intro to JS homework, we had you attach an image to the web page, and if you don't have that image in your path, like in your directory, it will show up an alt text that says, oh, if you see this image, that means you're doing something incorrectly. That message is basically the alt text of the image. So this is, again, really good because people with impairments, they use screen readers to understand the contents of the page. If they can't see the images on your page, they can use their screen reader to read the alt text that is related to each image. And so that's a really important way to make your images on your webpage more accessible to people. And finally, I think we have semantic HTML. So on the right side, you can see that on the top, there's div containers, and inside those div containers is another div container, and the only, I guess, differentiating factor between those two different div containers is the ID name. But people who use screen readers, they won't be able to tell, that is a header, that is a nav, that's an article, and that's a section. So instead, you should use semantic HTML, which is on the bottom. So instead of doing div for everything, there's actually HTML tags like header, nav, article, section that you can use to indicate different sections of your page. Yeah, so these are some examples of HTML tags that you can use to define different parts of your page. And in addition to those, you can also use like headings like H1, H2, all the way to H6. That also indicates to the user that, these are headings and these specify different sections on your page. Yeah, so that's pretty much it for the design lecture. I hope that this lecture kind of opened your eyes to a lot of different problems that people with impairments and disabilities face in regards to like using technology. And as web designers, hopefully you guys will take in consideration all these different rules and guidelines that really help improve the accessibility of your websites.